Hey YouTube, Twig here, bringing you all an update to my Magical Musketeer Yu-Gi-Oh deck profile for September 2022. Been wanting to update the deck for a good while now. I actually had been collecting all the components for the Magical Musketeer deck up again and finally got around to having all the cards needed for it. I would say a couple cards are definitely needing a reprint for this pack. We got a few of the Magical Musketeer monsters reprinted a while back, but some of the spells and traps are definitely just becoming more and more difficult to find, but still pretty awesome deck that focuses on setting up specific columns and being able to activate the many different Magical Musketeer spell and traps from your hand while controlling the other ones in the same columns that you would activate them. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the deck profile. We'll go ahead and start off with the main deck monsters. For the Magical Musketeer monsters, I am running 3 Magical Musketeer Casper. During either player's turn, you can activate Magical Musketeer spell and trap cards from your hand. If it is a spell or trap is activated in this card's column, except during the damage step, you can add 1 Magical Musketeer card from your deck to your hand, but not a card with the same name as the activated card. You can only use this effect of Magical Musketeer Casper once per turn. So it's actually a Magical Musket card. That is my mistake there, because that is the name of the different spells that you run in the deck. But still, being a searcher, it's a definite 3-of for that setup, along with one of our other 3-ofs being Magical Musketeer Starfire. During either player's turn, you can activate Magical Musket spell or traps from your hand, and if a spell or trap is activated in the same card column as this one, you can special summon 1 level 4 or lower Magical Musket monster from your deck in defense position, except for Starfire. You can only use this effect of Starfire once per turn. So you have the search power with Casper and the special summon power Starfire. The biggest thing is just setting up more and more columns with these cards, so the more monsters you can summon out, definitely the stronger and more options you'll have available to you for this deck. For the other 3-ofs, for the Magical Musketeers, I also run 3 Magical Musketeer Kid Brave. During either player's turn, you can activate Magical Musket spell or trap card from your hand, and if a spell or trap card is activated in this card's column, you can discard 1 Magical Musket card to draw 2 cards. You can only use this effect of Musketeer Kid Brave once per turn, but this gives you more of a consistency to get to some of the more important cards in your hand. It has to be a Magical Musket card, so remember that for the discard, but still great for potentially drawing into some better cards to use, like some hand traps and other setup cards. And having the higher attack of our other 2 monsters makes it more of a heavy hitter to use against your opponent. For some of the lower numbers, for the other Magical Musketeer cards, I also run 1 Magical Musketeer Dock. During either player's turn, you can activate Magical Musket spell traps just like the other ones, and with this one you can add 1 Magical Musket card from your graveyard to your hand when one is activated, when a spell or trap is activated in the same column as this. And remember, with the activation, it also goes off of your opponent's cards as well. That's why placing your Magical Musketeer cards in the proper columns definitely does matter for this deck. I also run 1 Magical Musketeer Calamity for the option to target 1 Magical Musket monster in your graveyard and special summon it. So the graveyard plays are definitely useful with this card as well. And also 1 Magical Musket Mastermind Zachiel. You contribute summon this face-up card by attributing 1 Magical Musket monster. And also, during either player's turn, you can activate Magical Musket spell or trap cards from your hand, and once per turn during your opponent's end phase, you can draw cards equal to the number of Magical Musket spell or trap cards you activate this turn, and that will face up in your field. And you can only use this effect of Mastermind Zachiel once per turn. So just more draw setup with this card. Only a 1-of for this one, and the other 2, they're more late game options, which you can set up on the field a lot more easily as well, depending on what you open up with. But for the rest of the main deck monsters, I also just run 3 Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. I don't focus too much else on actual hand traps, for the fact that the main part of the deck comes around to activating spell or traps in the same columns as these cards. So with hand traps, the more hand traps you open up, the less the actual deck can play off of its own card abilities. That's it for the main deck monsters. We'll now move on to the spells. I run 3 Magical Musket Cross Domination. With this card, if you control a Magical Musket monster, target 1 face-up monster on the field until the end of this turn, changes its attack and defense to 0, and also it has its effects negated. You can only use this effect once per turn, but with this card being able to activate 1 per turn, it's still sort of like an infinite impermanence for a spell lineup, while also being able to reduce that monster's attack. Very, very scary, but still, it all depends on where you activate this card in the proper columns as well, because then you can just gain the additional card effects of your Magical Musketeer monsters also because of it. I also run 2 Magical Musket Steady Hands. Target 1 Magical Musket monster you control. Its attack and defense become double its original attack and defense until the end of this turn. It cannot attack directly during this turn. You activate this card, and you can only activate 1 magical musket steady hands per turn, but still a big power boost to whatever you would target with this card, especially if you were to use Zachiel for some heavy numbers with this card. And even if you were to just have your opponent attack into one of your magical musketeer monsters, that damage increase could definitely be scary, and for the fact that you can activate this from your hand as well if you control that magical musketeer monster. I also run 3 Ties of the Brethren, so you can set up your columns pretty easily. If you just have your Casper on the field, then use Ties of the Brethren to special summon a Kid Brave, and then magical musketeer Doc as well onto the field, giving you your monsters needed for the column setup. From there, you are locked in to the special summons, but you have 3 monsters on the field that have additional effects when you activate other spells in the same columns, and then your opponent has to work around where they activate their cards as well. So you can even just set them up in front of the columns that you know your opponent may try to work with, whether they're a pendulum deck or something else like that. And for some of the other generic spells in the deck, I also run 2 Forbidden Chalice and 2 Cosmic Cyclone. This just comes down to having more quick play spells to use on your opponent's turn to then activate the spell or trap in the same column as your magical musketeer card. Cosmic Cyclone to take care of back row, and Forbidden Chalice to take care of your opponent's monsters, while all being able to do so on your opponent's turn. I also, for the rest of the spells, run 1 Upstart Goblin and 1 Monster Reborn. This is just easy spells to use in the same columns. There's really no restrictions for either of these, just having a monster in the graveyard for Monster Reborn, and then giving your opponent a few life points for the draw, and then also being able to activate one of your magical musketeer monsters. And now moving on to the traps, once again, like the other cards, being able to be activated during your turn or your opponent's turn if you have the magical musketeer on the field. I run 3 Magical Musket Last Stand. When your opponent activates a spell or trap card, will you control a magical musket monster, negate the activation, and also destroy that card. You can only activate 1 Magical Musket Last Stand per turn, but still very, very useful for the spell and trap negation while just controlling your magical musketeers. It's also a counter trap, so then your opponent will only be able to respond with other counter traps if you do activate this card. And I also run 3 Magical Musket Desperado. If you control a magical musket monster, target 1 face-up card on the field, destroy it. You can only activate 1 per turn, but still useful for destruction against your opponent, and another 3 of. I also run 2 Magical Musket Dancing Needle. This is the banish option. You target up to 3 cards in the graveyards and banish them, so this can take away some resources your opponent may be using by just activating this in response to a graveyard play they would be trying to do. And also, to finish off the traps, 3 Infinite Impermanence, along with the negation that you can get off of Infinite Impermanence of a column itself. You have this card to activate during your turn and use it, also just being able to set it the following way and then use your own magical musketeer monsters because of it. And that is it for the main deck. We'll now move on to the extra deck. For the Link monsters, I am running 3 Magical Musketeer Max. It just needs 1 level 8 or lower Magical Musket monster. If this card is Link Summon, you can activate 1 of these effects. You can add 1 Magical Musket spell or trap with a different name from your deck to your hand up to the number of monsters your opponent controls, or special summon Magical Musket monsters with different names from your deck up to the number of spell or traps your opponent controls. You can only use this effect of Magical Musketeer Max once per turn, and during either player's turn, you can activate Magical Musketeer spell or traps from your hand. So this is a going great second card because, 1, if it's Link Summon, you add cards based on the number of cards on the field that your opponent controls. So going into it first really doesn't do much aside from just giving you a magical musketeer monster in the graveyard for you to either special summon back onto the field or just set up the columns properly because of it. But I also run 1 Nightmare Phoenix, 1 Nightmare Cerberus, 1 IP Masquerena, 1 Underclock Taker, 1 Master King Archfiend, and also 1 Hippo Shenengan for all the Link 2 monsters. A pretty generic lineup, but they are light attribute monsters with the Fiend typing as well. So that's why I have these last 2 picks in here for those summons. And for the higher Link monsters, I run 1 Nightmare Unicorn, 1 Access Code Talker, 1 Borrelsword Dragon, and 1 Apollosa, Bow of the Goddess. With the Xyz monsters, I went for more of the rank 3 options. You do have some level 4s in the deck in the form of Starfire and also your Calamity, but if you wanted to go for one of those, you can always put in Baguska or Tornado Dragon. I just have the 1 Phantom Knight's Breaksword and the 1 Dante for the rank 3 plays for more of the setup in the graveyard and recycle, and then destruction of my opponent's own cards using Breaksword. As for some of the go-to plays in the deck, I already spoke of the Ties of the Brethren, but this deck definitely does fall on a lot of setup based on what cards your opponent may use. So just knowing where to place your magical Musketeer cards and then go for those additional activations will just come down to you setting up your monster on the field, setting that additional spell as well, unless it's a magical Musketeer spell or trap, which you can just activate from your hand, setting it up but still being able to then activate it the following turn, let's say when your opponent tries to use a field spell, and then activating the same play off of your magical Musketeer to add an additional one to your hand, or even going for more of the special summon play with Starfire, having that activation can then just set up other columns that your opponent may try to go for in response to this, and then going for that monster in the same column will then resolve if they activate any other card in that column aside from what you may have just activated also in that said column. And that's what playing off of the plays of your opponent is what's so important about the magical Musketeer deck. But that is it for the deck profile. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I was definitely happy to finally be able to update this deck once again. Definitely one I overlooked, but glad I finally got around to doing an update for. And as always, until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And Kira Twig out.